What's up, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Purple Bear Biology. In this episode, we are going to discuss some of the evidence that currently supports evolution of the biodiversity we see all around us in the world. While there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that can be observed and documented, I want to focus our conversation on four primary pieces of evidence: direct observations of change in a population, morphological and genomic similarities between organisms, fossil support of descent with modification, and biogeographic similarities between species separated by large distances. Let's start this conversation with direct observations of evolution. Now, for the most part, observing genetic changes in a population can take thousands of years, but for some organisms with fast generation times and rapid changes, we can observe evolution over a much shorter period of time. From our video over antibiotic resistance, you know that bacteria are one of the organisms that can exhibit this type of rapid change. If you missed that video, you should check it out. But what about other organisms outside of bacteria? Let's use soapberry bugs. These cute little critters are native inhabitants of southern Florida and normally feed on a plant called balloon vine. In addition to this food source, a plant called golden rain tree was introduced from Asia to Florida, and soapberry bugs can feed on this fruit because it has a very similar structure to the native plant's fruit. However, there is one striking difference between the two fruits. Balloon vine has a much thicker outer case around the fruit compared to golden rain tree. Now, this may seem like a minor difference, but it directly affects soapberry bug adaptations. You see, these insects feed through a mouth part that is kind of like a straw or syringe that they stab into the fruits and then suck out the sugary goodness from the inside. To be successful, soapberry bugs need a mouth long enough to get to the fruit. Scientists observing this particular trend proposed that populations separated on the two plants over multiple generations would begin to show physical evolution in their mouth parts. And indeed, after doing a census, this is exactly what they found. The average beak length was about 8.5 millimeters in length for soapberry bugs on balloon vine, while on golden rain tree the average was less than 7 millimeters. This is a direct example of a species becoming fragmented with varying environmental selective pressures, resulting in modifications of physical attributes of the population as a whole. I know what you're thinking. Professor Hurley, that's just a small mouth part. How could that lead to evolution of a new species? Well, this is the remarkable thing about evolution. We are not talking about huge changes over a short period of time. We're talking about small changes over a prolonged period of time, resulting in subtle differences that cause two populations of the same species to become more and more dissimilar until they can no longer interbreed and thus become two separate species. Now, direct observation is pretty remarkable, but we can also see evidence within organisms as well. Much like Darwin's observations, we can find that organisms are distinctly different due to genetic variation. However, they also have striking similarities in their morphologies and genetic code. One example of morphological similarities can be seen in the forelimb structures between these different organisms. Here we can see that while definitely modified, the bone structure in the limbs between very distinct groups of organisms is quite similar. These characteristics are due to close common relationships between the organisms. You can kind of think of this like how you and your cousin may have similar features because you're closely related. When organisms have similar characteristics due to close common ancestry, we call these characteristics homologous traits. In contrast, sometimes we see traits that develop quite differently to adapt to similar environments, like wings of a bird and the wings of an insect. These traits accomplish the same function, but are not due to close common ancestry between the two groups. Instead, they are similar adaptations developed and selected for by similar environmental conditions. Sometimes we even see similar morphological features and functions of these types of traits, but we know that the organisms have been separated for thousands of years. This scenario can be seen wonderfully in sugar gliders and flying squirrels. These two organisms are and have been separated by miles of ocean with no connectivity between the two species anywhere in the recent past. But they are very similar in structure and function. When organisms come from very distant common ancestors but develop very similar morphologies, we refer to this as convergent evolution. The similarities between organisms does not stop just at morphology. There are profound similarities between genomes as well. First and foremost, all of life uses the same genetic information and builds proteins using the same amino acids. When we look at the genomes of closely related organisms, we also find genes that are no longer being used, but were used in common ancestors. These so-called pseudogenes enable us to document relationships and better understand lineages. For example, comparing the olfactory receptor genes across multiple groups, we can see that our more distant relatives, like mice, have a relatively large proportion of their olfactory genes that are functional. However, as we move closer to humans, fewer and fewer of those genes are functional but still present. As much as 19,000 pseudogenes may be present inside of the human genome. Not only do some genes get carried over due to ancestry, but sometimes morphological features are remnants of our ancestry as well. Characteristics that no longer serve their original purpose, but can be explained by ancestry, are called vestigial traits. Some common examples include the pelvic bones in whales and snakes. With no legs to walk on, these features appear misplaced in these organisms. We as humans also have vestigial traits, including things like our appendix, our tonsils, our tailbone, and our wisdom teeth. One important thing to note is that calling a trait vestigial does not mean that the trait no longer serves a function. It just no longer serves the function that it did in the ancestor that it developed inside of. For example, whales have pelvic bones and they don't walk, but the pelvic bones still serve the function for reproduction. If you're interested in how science discovered this, you can look at this article where the scientists explain the function of the pelvic bone outside of being able to walk. So what can we conclude from all of that? Well, morphological and genomic data suggest diversity developed from common ancestry. The same pieces make up all of us, but they have all been modified over time, which gives us the variation we see. So at this point, you're probably thinking, what about fossils? I want to talk about fossils, Professor Hurley. Pleasantly, I think that the evidence is pretty straightforward for fossils. Much like looking at similar morphological characteristics between species that are living, we can look at fossilized remains of ancestors to track the progression to new species. We can also use similarities in the fossil record to relate species to one another. One distinct advantage to fossils is that they enable us to compare entire groups of organisms that may have gone extinct and explain some of the gaps between currently living organisms. The last piece of evidence that we're going to explore is something called biogeography. If we look around the globe at organisms on different continents, we find incredible similarities between groups that appear to be descendants from the same ancestral group. How could entirely terrestrial species separated by oceans be closely related? Well, the land hasn't always been separated. Our continents moved around the globe in the past. In fact, they're still moving as we speak. Now, this does not occur rapidly, or we'd be able to feel it. Instead, they shift around at a pace less than 5 centimeters a year. When the continents were all together, organisms could move freely around the supercontinent called PANGEA. As the continents separate from each other, populations of the same species became isolated from one another, and different environments selected for slight modifications in the traits that we see in those organisms. Isn't that also cool? We as humans are just beginning to explore the complexity of ancestry of the biodiversity of the planet. While all species have unknown changes and modifications, what we do know is that organisms are similar because they are related and will continue to change into the future. Well, that's it for this episode of Purple Bear Biology. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment section below, and make sure to like, share, and subscribe to continue to explore the amazing world of biology with me. As always, thanks for watching, and see y'all next time.